Pawating, Donjaba, Ajijakan Dodem, and Shnabe Ojibwe and Ao. Very glad to be home. We've been away for a while, about 3 years, actually over 3 years. And it's very good for us to be back. I was telling April and others as I was returning to Michigan periodically, when we were out west, either in Arizona or Colorado, every time I would fly over the lakes and the trees, it was like the spirits here were just kind of reaching up and pulling me down. And it's just a very overpowering feeling to be home. So I'm very glad to be back. But we've learned some really cool things in our travels, and I certainly don't regret being out west and seeing other tribal nations and other organizations that are really struggling with the idea of American Indian education across Indian country. And so it's really an important area, I think, deserving of its own study. Oftentimes when we deal with general education, they kind of think of Indian education as just kind of subsumed under what they do. And that's unfortunate because it's such a unique area of education. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about where the ideas come from for these seminars, and we'll get into some good discussion about some of the activities that we would do online or in person, as it were today. And we'll have a lot of fun, I think, and it's going to go by real fast, so I'm going to shut up and move on. April already kind of introduced the seminars to you. Just a little bit about the way we structured it. They're 2-credit, either graduate or undergraduate level, and they're 16 weeks long. They kind of run in conjunction with the university semester cycles. We usually run them in the fall and the spring. We usually don't run them in the summer just because there's a lot other stuff going on in the summer. So. A little bit about the partnership. TEDNA, the Tribal Education Department's National Assembly, is the primary sponsoring agency. So really it's kind of their baby. They are the people who sign on to deliver it, make sure it happens. TEDNA identified a need across Indian country for professional development in the area of American Indian education. And there's a serious need out there. There's a lot of folks out there who are doing Indian education, and they're not doing it very well. And some people are trying to do their best, but they have little to work with. And oftentimes, take no offense what I say here, but oftentimes our front line of Indian education is underpaid, overworked Indian education workers who have had little to no support in what they do. These people are fantastic. These people put their all into their work every day. But what support have we given them in their university experience with education, with American Indian education? What have we given them to work with in the schools besides low pay and measly federal Indian education budget? So I guess that's, you're getting my soapbox, but that's kind of where my passion is. The Interwest Equity Assistance Center, where I work, provided a resource person, me, for seminar development and facilitation. And so that was kind of the major cost of the partnership. And the Interwest Equity Assistance Center certainly should be applauded for recognizing a need and filling it with my time and my energy for this identified need in Indian country. Colorado State University has approved the seminars as distance education workshops, which are able to be provided at low cost for graduate or undergraduate credit. That's a very important component because we need legitimacy within the university systems. We need to be able to provide credit for people who actually need the content, but also need the credits for their professional development purposes. And this also makes it very attractive to teachers in general because they can use these credits then for renewal for their certification. And so there's method to our madness in aligning ourselves with universities, School of Education. So, moving on. The first one of the series that we certainly encourage everybody to take, although we have really no requirements to have intro and law and politics before best practices and tribal state-specific issues. But certainly if people are unfamiliar with the area of Indian education, we'd encourage them to take intro first. And there's reasons because we cover a great deal of fundamentals. And a lot of the stuff that you'll find in the intro course, people who have been in Indian education sometimes for many, many years can learn things that they may have kind of glossed over in their own experience. I've talked, some of you know who Dr. Sandra Fox is. She's the author of the Creating Sacred Places curriculum for the National Indian School Board Association. She approached me one time and she said, after I had presented about the intro course, she said, you know, Marty, I've been doing this for over 40 years, Indian education. And she said, and some of the things that we talked about today, I should have had 40 years ago because it might have made a difference. And so she says it's certainly making a difference now. But she wishes she had it then. Imagine, some of our elders in Indian education feeling very at a loss today. So this covers history, a very important piece of American Indian education. If we don't recognize what happened through the history of Indian education, we may blunder through Indian education today, which would be a travesty, because sometimes we only have an opportunity once to make a difference. Some of us have many opportunities. I've been very blessed with many opportunities to do some good things in Indian education. But if we don't know history, we may repeat it. A very big, for instance, is the boarding school experience. And many of us are familiar with what happened in American Indian boarding schools. I'm not going to really go into it because it would take a whole semester just to talk about that, or longer, or lifetimes. But it was a very well-meaning federal policy. People really did have their heart maybe in the right place, but the way they approached it was very wrong and very disruptive to American Indian cultures. It was, in fact, the most disruptive era of Indian education ever. It killed, the motto for what they say the motto was for Pratt, who was kind of the leader of the implementation process, is kill the Indian and save the man. And that's very unfortunate because, in fact, I think many times they accomplished, they were successful in that, and they really did kill the spirit of individuals, some of them who never made it back. If you ever go to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and visit the Carlisle Indian School graveyard, here's these little itty-bitty gravestones, these kids who were taken forcibly away from their parents, put into boarding schools, never returned. Very sad. But anyway, that's why history is a very important component. We need a background in it in order to realize what our place is in it. We get into the who, what, where, when, why, and how. The when, of course, is the history. The who is us. And we're going to talk more about defining, because we're going to actually get into some exercise here. This is primarily asynchronous delivery. We use the discussion forum. We've used WebCT 4.0 and 6.0 for this. I'm a very strong proponent of using technology to address Indian education concerns. It's an area that really has not gotten the attention it really deserves across Indian country, using the technology for these things. Text-based discussions we use. Let's see. I'll show you the books we use. And then periodic live chats with American Indian education professionals. The required text is one of the texts is something I co-authored with my former assistant director, Tracy Madej, called the Interdisciplinary Manual for American Indian Inclusion. It's a free publication right now if you can download it from the edoptions.com website. And then we also use American Indian Education and History by John Reinhardt and Gene Eder. And then we supplement that with many other materials throughout the semester. So one of the things that we start off the semester with, and we do this primarily through the discussion forum. And for those of you who are familiar with discussion forums, this may be old news, but for those of you who are not, discussion forums really are kind of like threaded discussions. It's kind of like posting something to a site where everybody can read it, and then everybody has an opportunity to respond to that and so forth. And it kind of gets threaded out after a long time. And it's very useful for public interactions via the web, at least public within the course. It's not open to the general public by any means. But each seminar participant is asked to define American Indian education in their own words, and then post their definitions in a discussion forum. After they do this, which is kind of the initial exercise, we read through the Interdisciplinary Manual for American Indian Inclusion. And then the participants are encouraged to discuss their own definition and others based on the conceptual models included in the manual. So first they define it in their own words. Then we do some reading, and then we come back and do some discussion. Would you guys like to do some brief, hyphenated version of that at this point? Sure? Okay. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to think, what is your definition of American Indian education? And, this is kind of the elevator speech. If you were to get on an elevator, not the one out here because it's only 2 floors, but say at NIEA. Say you go to NIEA in one of these metropolitan areas and you got this hotel that has 20 floors. So you get on the first floor and someone gets on there with you and they say, hey, what are you here for? The National Indian Education Association Conference. Oh, really? What's Indian education about? And you would respond as such. So that's what I really want, your elevator speech. What's going to roll off the tip of your tongue if you're asked that? And someone's going to be enlightened by your words because that's what you carry with you, because that's what's really important. So who wants to volunteer to be this elevator rider? I'll be the stranger who meets you. Role-playing is a very good way to deal with American Indian education, and all education, by the way. Come on, role-playing. Someone be brave. Come on up. Yeah, come on. Okay, we're going to share the mic here.
Oh, okay.
All right, so we get on the elevator. I hit floor 20, and you just happen to be on floor 20 also. And I say, hey, what is your name?
Penny Brandt.
Penny, I'm Marty. I'm here for some kind of other thing. What are you here for?
I'm here for education on how to facilitate Native American education.
Oh, okay. Well, what is American Indian education?
It's not one basket of things. It's a lot of things dumped into the same basket, but my primary want on it is to find a way to bring the balance of the teachings from the past and bring them in a language that children and the adults of today can understand, and then can incorporate that in their own lives. We can't expect all the traditions to be as they were, but we can expect the traditions to enrich the lives now and to give the lives now meaning.
Wow, that's quite a thing you're working on there. That's amazing. Oh, floor 20, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. That'd be a pretty intensive elevator conversation, wouldn't it? Thank you. That was a great response. Others want to play the elevator game with me. Just one other person. Then we'll move on. We don't have a whole lot of time. Come on, Tanya. Come on up here. You got to pretend like I don't know Tanya. All right. Ding, ding. Hit floor 20. Hi, I'm Marty.
Hi, I'm Tanya.
Hi, Tanya. What are you here for?
American Indian Education Conference on the 20th floor.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Well, I think it's educating American Indian students and providing education for them, and providing American Indian history education for everybody.
Oh, that's pretty neat. So you guys cover, like, the history of Indian education? Is that what you really focus on?
Well, we try to provide that to people in the education field, as well as help American Indian students grab hold of that and then become students that will maybe be college-bound.
Oh, that's really good. College. I heard some president at one of the universities talk about the importance of college and how we really should be paying more attention to education rather than economy or something something that I can't remember.
Yes.
Some provocative thought he was.
We have a lot of talent wasted with our youth that do not decide to go to college, and hopefully we can encourage some of our students to attend college and help out our economy by becoming good workers.
Sounds great. Wish I could come to that conference. Thank you. Floor 20. All right. Thank you, guys. You're great. Appreciate that. Okay, so that was kind of a hyphenated approach, but it's one that works for our purposes here. But that's really kind of what I want the participants in the seminar to do, too. I don't want them to give me somebody else's definition. I want their definition. What works for them? What's their reality? What's their real-world experience in dealing with this phenomenon that we call American Indian education? So I want them to post that and work from there. So then we get into some of the models in the manual. Now, one of the primary models that we use is the branches and roots of American Indian education. And I am a little bit biased because these are my models. These are models that we've made up through over the years. Many of my friends here have contributed to these models, to my thinking about what I consider American Indian education. And so this one here is the branches and roots of American Indian education. At its roots, you see indigenous knowledge systems. This is where Indian education comes from. in that pre-colonial context. And so we really get into the idea about what would Indian education have looked like in a pre-colonial context. Now, certainly we can read about that in text, but we can also find out about that from our languages, our native languages, as we talk about what is a pre-colonial word or term versus a post-colonial. That tells us a lot about who we are. Our artifacts, even though I'm a very cautious person when it comes to archaeology because of the impact that archaeology's had on Indian communities in our grieving process, I'm also very cognizant that our artifacts can teach us things. We can see what our ancestors may have been providing. We think we're taught about the seven generations philosophy of leadership and education. Well, that's very important that we look to the past. We look to that pre-colonial context and what happened as a result of that major branching when we have the American Indian education splitting into the education of American Indians and the education of non-Indians. And so you heard some of that in the definitions today. We heard about how do we bring those pre-colonial systems, the good stuff forward from our ancestors. How do we honor and respect those things that they had put in place for our future? How do we also deal with the very unique characteristics of American Indian specific when we're dealing with American Indian students? How is that different from non-Indian students? Do they have the same needs? Do they have the same aspirations? Do they have the same citizenship? Do they have the same rights? There are a lot of questions that need to be answered because we can't use a cookie-cutter approach. And that's sometimes, I think, where we tend to fall. In public education, they oftentimes get to a point where they are trying to use a cookie-cutter approach. And it really is a disservice to American Indian education. So you can see that within the sub-branches, after that major branching occurs, and I'm going to step away from the mic a little bit, so I'm just going to maybe need that other one. That's why I kind of point some things out to you as I'm going through this. I don't think we have a laser pointer here either, so. Can you hear me now? Okay. So when we get to these sub-branches of American Indian education, on the Indian education of Indian people, we can fully expect that this may happen differently than the education of non-Indian people. And what we find is that there are some obvious disparities. Now, when we're talking about the education of Indian people, especially by non-Indian people. And what I mean when I say that is, it's a fact that we have 99% of the people out there educating Indian people who are non-Indian. 99% of the educators and administrators, the teachers and administrators in our public school systems are non-Indian, and they're teaching Indian kids. There may be some disconnect there. There may be some discontinuity in their cultural backgrounds and their experiences. And believe me, it does make a difference. We don't want it to make a difference, but it certainly does. And, what about the people who are in the classroom and they're using non-Indian content to teach Indian people? Non-Indian content. Well, sometimes we say, well, it's good content for all kids. But, we also have folks out there who say, well, culturally based education can really make a difference. When we have American Indian content that reflects the traditional values of American Indian students, and it reflects their real-world experiences, their tribal communities are included in the content. It doesn't always have to be historical. It can be very contemporary. But it does make a difference. Where it happens, where Indian education happens. We can be maybe at the Hannahville Indian School. Is that going to make a difference if we're at Hannahville Indian School or maybe if we're downtown Columbus, Ohio? You bet. Yeah, because they're going to be much more cognizant and aware and sensitive to the idea of what is American Indian versus non-Indian and how that makes a difference. Why we do it? Very important question. Why do we do Indian education? And is it different based on who we are and our backgrounds? I tell people we better be very concerned about why we do Indian education. Because if we're doing it for the wrong reasons or we're doing it it for reasons that are not in line with our traditional values, we may be going down the wrong path. If we're doing Indian education to make AYP, I don't know that that's the best thing for our tribal communities and our children. I don't know that that's the best thing for 7 generations ahead. Maybe it's part of it. Maybe making AYP is part of that equation, but it certainly shouldn't be the reason we do it in the first place. I think I would propose that we do education, Indian education, for the good life. And that wouldn't be too much different than the ancient philosophers from Greece and wherever else. People educate for the good life. Well, from an Anishinaabe Ojibwe perspective, the good life might be radically different than what the Greek good life would be because of who we are. So we got to think about those things. And then how do we do it? How do we do Indian education? What are the methodologies that we use? How do we get these things across to our students? There's been some studies that have both looked at general education and Indian education. I think the Center for Research on Education Excellence and Diversity, CREED, and I probably got the name screwed up there, but no problem. You'll figure it out later. But CREED actually looked at general education. They had the 5 standards for effective pedagogy. And these standards, they're pretty commonly talked about across the country as things that we would want to do, how we do education in general. But they also added 2 standards to their framework for American Indian specific. And there's a reason they did that, because they thought about the unique characteristic of American Indian education. So if you look at both sides of the major branching, it definitely does make a difference. We don't always want it to make a difference because we feel like, well, non-Indian teachers can be just as effective as Indian teachers or vice versa. But would it make a difference if I were to come in here today and not present myself as Martin Reinhardt, who has an Anishinaabe Ojibwe background, who has a wealth of experience in Indian education? What if I was just to get up here and start rattling off stuff about Indian education and not tell you who I was? Would it matter? It would matter because of the legitimacy, because of the experience, the connection that I have with that. And it does matter. When we're talking about family history, we're talking about our roots, we're talking about some of those insights. It does matter. Now, we can certainly create teachers. We can certainly influence their ideas, and we need to do that, believe me. But we're never going to get to a point where our identity doesn't matter. It always will, especially given the history. So if you take that tree, that analogy of that tree, and you were to cut it in half, say, we don't really want to kill the tree, but we got to see what's at the core. What's the core of this tree? The concentric rings of Indian education. We know because people like Gregory Kahete have gone around to Indian communities, and he's done a lot of research in the area of traditional education systems. And one thing that he found is that all traditional education systems from an Indian perspective kind of focus around the idea of spirituality. Spiritually based education systems. Now, I think that might be just a little bit different from mainstream education. Just a little bit. I'm kind of spitballing here, but okay. It's obviously very different, and that matters. When we're talking about the Establishment Clause and separation of church and state and how we kind of flee away from the idea of spirituality, which we often think of as religion in public schools, well, what does that do for Indian people whose traditional education systems are rooted in spirituality? It's a very big disconnect. We don't treat the whole child without treating the spiritual core. That should be first and foremost. Around that core of spirituality, we have family and clan immersion. We have native languages. We have seeking a vision, traditional homeland, values, survival skills, storytelling, gathering, ceremonies, home building, music, warrior skills, hunting, fishing, gathering, plant knowledge. You get all these things that were really common and core, built around that idea of spirituality, our relationship with the rest of the world. As you get to those outer rings, you start to see how Indian education has started to take on some of this new stuff with that major branching. What happens when we start getting the education of non-Indian people about India stuff, or the education of Indian people by non-Indian people. You start to see these cross-cultural ideas start to take shape in Indian education. You start to see things like non-Indian farming, colonial histories, English and other foreign languages adopted or have been adapted into our systems. reading, writing in that other languages. Western science, mathematics, vocational training. On the very outer ring, you see communications. We're talking about like cell phones, and we're talking about distance education. We're talking about webcasts of American Indian education seminars. We're talking about media. Dances with Wolves is a form of education. I was here in Marquette at the NMU powwow, and one of the students from the local community here actually came up and started speaking Lakota. And I was very impressed because, it's very impressive to see a youth speaking their native language. And so I told this person, I said, "Oh, that's very cool that you speak your native language." And she said, "Oh, no, that's not my native language." I said, "Well, it's cool that you speak Lakota then. It's very, very neat to see a child be able to speak that." She said, "Oh, no, I don't speak it. I just memorize it from Dances with Wolves." Yeah, media definitely affects how we do Indian education, no doubt, common knowledge. The Internet, artificial intelligence, standardized tests, virtual caves, computer technology. Does anyone remember what virtual caves, or anyone ever heard of virtual caves? Anyone ever seen Star Trek? The holodeck? The holodeck. Okay, so, James T. Kirk, he goes into the holodeck, he steps in, and he closes the door, and it's just this huge room that's completely white. There's a white ceiling, white floor, white walls, and he says, "Computer, bring up Vulcan in the year 3036. Show me Spock and his father on the edge of the volcano talking about Spock being half human, half Vulcan." And all of a sudden, the computer-wise room just comes alive, and there's Spock and his dad on the edge of this volcano that's erupting, and they're sitting there kind of talking because, it doesn't faze them. They're Vulcans. And, they're talking about Spock, and all of a sudden, James T. Kirk, he kind of walks over and says, "Hey, Spock, why is it that you have this emotion that you hide?" And Spock says, "Well, Captain, the idea of emotion is a very illogical flaw in my character," or something to that effect. You know how Spock talks. And then James T. Kirk steps back, and they go on talking like James T. Kirk was never there. Virtual caves are much like this holodeck experience. And we have these now. I mean, imagine right now if we had holodecks or virtual caves, which we do, someone putting on some specialized equipment, going into this room, this computerized room where they have a virtual keyboard and can give voice commands, and they can bring up scenes. And we have one at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute pretty close by. I'm not sure if we have any in Michigan yet. I'm sure we probably do somewhere. But imagine if I were to say, computer on the keyboard, bring up the coral reef, one of the Pacific coral reefs. And someone at the University of Alaska Anchorage goes into their virtual cave, and they log into another virtual cave system, and they look for my session. They say, "Oh, computer, find Marty's virtual cave session that's going on right now." And all of a sudden, they enter into this virtual experience with me. So now, not only am I there, they're there. And maybe someone in China goes into the same system, and it's this live interaction that we're all sharing. We're all appearing at this coral reef. We're all sharing this visual, auditory experience where we're actually learning about coral reefs. Now, that's very possible, and they're doing this today. Very exciting stuff. Imagine if we did that with Indian education stuff. Imagine if I went into a virtual cave environment and programmed, say, the War of 1812, where Tecumseh is, out on that battlefield fighting against the United States, one of our cultural heroes fighting against the United States. Well, how could that be very educational for everybody today in the area of education? What if we were to ask Tecumseh, I know you're busy fighting against the United States with all this, major confederation here, but what can you tell us maybe about how the United States is interacting with the tribes in Afghanistan? Is there some kind of lesson we could learn from the War of 1812 and our confederation against the United States for now the confederation of tribes in Afghanistan against the United States? Is there maybe something we can learn? I don't know. Something about tribal, something about warfare, military, something about culture and values and homeland and stuff like that. Just maybe there's something we could learn. So imagine if we could do that, if we could harness that energy to recreate or to create new stuff for Indian education using some of this technology. I'm very excited about the ideas. Finally, the last model here I want to share and keep moving on, the area of trilateral responsibility. At its roots, American Indian education was completely tribal, under tribal control. We controlled it. Nobody else, just tribes. Now, as a result of early settlement and colonial practices, The federal U.S. government inherited much of the responsibility for Indian education from its predecessors, and through the treaties and the protection of Aboriginal rights and subsequent federal legislation, the federal government now has kind of this overlap area where they share the responsibility for Indian education with tribes. Well, come along the 1930s, and the federal government said, you know what, we failed miserably in this boarding school project. We've really killed a lot of Indian people, made a mess of Indian country. Let's kind of step back away from that, and let's give some of that responsibility to the states. Because the states, they have these public school systems. They're educating most people anyway. In states, one of the hallmarks of state sovereignty is public education. So let's just give the states that responsibility. We'll pay the states through Johnson O'Malley programs, Impact Aid, and so on and so forth, Title VII Indian education programs. Let's let the states do Indian education. So all of a sudden, from 1934 till 2008, we see the states really stepping up to where they are now educating the major populace of American Indian people in public schools. So now we have this overlap between state and tribal and state and federal. Because the feds are not out of the picture, they still have to, they're still obliged to do what they're supposed to do because of treaty rights and Aboriginal rights. They're still tribal citizens, but now the states are educating most of them. 92% of American Indian kids in the United States are educated in state-run public schools. So, the area of trilateral responsibility, that's really where we're at today. It's a shared responsibility for Indian education between tribes, federal, and state. Very important model to consider as you're moving forward in your definitions of this. So, that being said, thinking about the two definitions that we had this morning, where is it in these models that we find these definitions? We have this idea of bringing those good things from our traditions forward, right? That was a major theme in the definition. At least that's what I caught. That's what I remembered, and that's what's most important. What do you remember from those definitions? Because this is a discussion, not just me telling you what you should remember. What else did we find in those definitions? You guys don't remember what they said? Okay. Yeah, the importance of the future. Who gets to determine the future of Indian education? Who gets to do that? Using these models. Who's in control? Okay. Yeah, the state has a lot to say about what's going on in the future of Indian education, don't they? Where 92% of our kids are out there, that means only 8% are in private or tribal. 92%. So the state has a lot to say about the future of Indian education. Isn't it then imperative that the states are listening to the tribes? Obviously, because the tribes have the most at stake. These are their kids. These are their citizens. If there's something very provocative that we probably need to explain to President Les Wong and others in positions of power like he is that the tribe's voice needs to be heard in state educational decision-making. This is a state-run university. Marquette Public Schools is state education system. Make no doubt, have no doubt about who controls this. It's not tribes. We need to make sure that the tribal voice is heard loud and clear, especially when it's our citizens involved in that future. We need to control it. A matter of sovereignty, a matter of survival. Okay. I know we need to move on because I have other courses I want to tell you about, but that would be the kind of an example of a discussion that we might have in the introduction to American Indian education. Now, some people might say, wow, that's pretty heavy-duty stuff for an introductory course, but man, we got to get right to it. Now, there's a lot that we need to cover, and we need to get into the thick of it because these are very serious issues. Okay, it's a good segue into the law and politics of American Indian education, because I use the same model that shared responsibility is the primary model that we use for the seminar on law and politics. This seminar is focused on unique legal and political educational relationships between American Indian tribes, federal government, state governments. We discuss Aboriginal rights and treaty rights, federal and state Indian education laws, and contemporary tribal laws regarding education. Again, it's primarily asynchronous, meaning we don't have a whole lot of real-time interactions, more based on when you're available. You can use the discussion forum. Intensive use of the discussion forum, text-based discussion, and periodic live chats with Indian education professionals. The materials that we use are primarily the Tribalizing Indian Education series, from the Native American Rights Fund that were pretty much developed by Melody McCoy and others. And those are actually available free online for reading, but if you want a copy of them, you're supposed to actually pay for them. So here's a really cool outcome of the pilot that when we ran this first seminar for law and politics, the Meskwaki Education Codes development. Very cool. A Meskwaki tribal attorney utilized this seminar as an opportunity to integrate current thinking on tribal education policy into the draft codes for the Meskwaki Nation. So we had an impact on tribal policy. And if you think about that, that's tribal national policy, because tribes are nations. So it's very cool to be able to interact with this participant in the seminar, but this is an actual attorney for the tribe who is charged with developing their draft codes. Very cool. They're incorporating concepts like the trilateral responsibility for Meskwaki education, Aboriginal rights, treaty rights, etc., that were the focus of the seminar discussion. Here's an activity that we do in the law and politics of Indian education. It's a treaty analysis exercise. Seminar participants are asked to review a set of treaties for educational content using 3 search types: keywords, similar words, and conceptual clusters. And we'll talk more about that. They're then asked to utilize the U.S. Supreme Court's canons of treaty construction to deconstruct each provision as best they can, given their background knowledge, and to post their analyses in the discussion forum. We then discuss their findings during a live chat session where they have the opportunity to engage each other and facilitator directly on the differences in their findings. So it's a really cool opportunity to get into some policy that a lot of people like to say treaty rights. You know, they say, well, why did people have the Michigan Indian Tuition Waiver? Why can Indian people utilize the Michigan Indian Tuition Waiver and other people can't? Well, our common response is because it's treaty right. But what do we really know about that very loaded response? It's a treaty right. Well, we need to talk about that more, because there's actually not just one treaty right for the Anishinaabe. There's 42 treaties, and there's 26 of those treaties that have educational provisions. So we need to be able to articulate better what is that body of treaty rights, and how does that body of treaty rights then really reflect Aboriginal right? Or how does it then reflect, how is it reflected in contemporary subsequent Indian education legislation like Title VII? We need to be able to span the historic eras when we respond to these things. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to engage in a little exercise real quick, if you don't mind. It's kind of fun. I think it's fun. You guys might say, you're crazy if you think this is fun. The canons of treaty construction, here they are. Ambiguities in treaties must be resolved in favor of the Indians. What's an ambiguity? An uncertainty, an unclarity, dual meanings, things like that, or multiple meanings. So ambiguities, unclear statements, unclear terms, must be resolved in the favor of the Indian side of the house. That's one canon. Indian treaties must be interpreted as the Indians would have understood them. Well, what does that mean? That means we need to know something about our ancestors, those Indian ancestors who would have been present at the time that these treaties were written. What was their understanding? We need to have some way to denote that, to find that information so that it can form this current interpretation. And then finally, Indian treaties must be construed liberally in favor of Indians now. What is liberal? Broadly, not conservatively, right? If I were to say 0 to 100, and 100 blocks of commodity cheese was on the table, and the treaty negotiation was moving toward 100 blocks being considered as payment for some kind of thing, or 1 block or no blocks, what would be the most liberal definition? 100 blocks of commodity cheese. Yeah, definitely Indian gold. So that would be on the table. We'd want that. Okay, so here's the treaty with the Wyandotte, etc., of 1817, which, by the way, is the treaty which the University of Michigan claims its foundations on, the Treaty of 1817. If you ever look at the seal of the University of Michigan, it says founded in 1817. Well, here you go. Here's the exact article that comes from, Article 16. Some of the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi tribes being attached to the Catholic religion and believing they may wish some of their children hereafter educated, there's a hint, do grant to the rector of the Catholic Church of St. Anne of Detroit for the use of said church and to the corporation of the college at Detroit. Hence, since then, has become the University of Michigan. For the use of said college to be retained or sold as the said director and the corporation may judge expedient, each one half of 3 sections of land to contain 640 acres. Now imagine 640 acres in that area today. How much would that be worth? A lot, especially on the river, which was very prime land. Can you imagine having riverfront property in that area today? Anyway, for use of, they reserve pieces of land for the Indians by the Treaty of Detroit, 1807, earlier treaty, and the superintendent of Indian Affairs in the territory of Michigan is authorized on part of the said Indians to select the said tracts of land. Okay, there are some key educational terms in here. We're not going to resolve all the terms because some of them are very land-based and other kind of alliances between church and state and tribes. But let's just look at some of the educational provisions. What jumps out at you, educational-wise? Okay, so something about where is it here? What's the exact words? We're looking for key terms. We're doing a key term search. Okay, so if we were to do, say, a computerized search of terms of this article, we might put in the term education or educate or educated or something to that effect, and we would hit on educated. Okay, so that would be a key term. Well, any similar terms? Similar terms that you may find for education? College, yeah, that's kind of a similar term. It has something to do with education. What about conceptual clusters? Now, you can't really use a computer to do a conceptual cluster. You have to look through it, and you find groups of words in context that have meaning. A conceptual cluster. Okay, for use of said Indians. That's a conceptual cluster because the use of said Indians indicates what? Yeah, it's their interest, their use. And we're talking about education, so it should be used for their education. You have to infer some things. It's contextual. It's conceptual clusters that you're not going to find just doing a simple search using a key term or a similar term. You have to look for what's the meaning surrounding it. So if we were to go through here and look at some of the ambiguity based on the canons of treaty construction, are there some things that are maybe a little ambiguous? Like what? What's ambiguous? How about a key term that may be a little bit ambiguous? Believing? Okay. Why would believing be ambiguous? Okay, and how would we know that? How would we know what their beliefs were? Some is certainly ambiguous. Some could mean a lot of things. May wish, may believe. Sure. Okay, so those who are to come, hereafter. Yeah, maybe a little ambiguous. I don't know. Is there ambiguity in hereafter? Hereafter, that's pretty specific. You know, it's the hereafter. All right. How about this? How about educated? Okay. Michelle, anish ejikadong education anishinabemwin. Kinamagewin. Anish ejikadong kinamagewin English. I'll help you out. According to Helen Roy, if you were to ask an Anishinaabemuin speaker, how do you say education in Anishinaabemuin? The common response would be something to the effect of Kinomage or Kinomagewin, depending on how you asked it. But if you reverse the translation from Anishinaabemuin back into English, the literal translation is the earth, it will show us the way. Now that's a very important process for finding meaning in ambiguous statements. One, Kino-Magiewan is actually a pre-colonial term. It comes from prior to U.S. infiltration of Anishinaabe territory. That's very important because that means our ancestors undoubtedly have this link, this linguistic link to pre-colonial meaning that there's thousands and thousands of years of traditional Indian education going on, the indigenous knowledge systems that informs that term. So, if we were to reverse that term and bring it back into English, the earth, it will show us the way. There's some key terms even in that translation. The earth. It undoubtedly, traditional Anishinaabe education system is tied to the earth. It's earth-based. So we talk about place-based education today. Well, what is place-based education? Throw out some characteristics. Place-based education. It's kind of knowing the world around you, using the earth around you, the environment, to teach you things about life, to teach you math, science, technology, language arts. I mean, you name it, place-based education seems to be very effective. It also is supposed to be empowering because it connects people to their surroundings. You know, it helps people get out and realize that, hey, we live somewhere. You know, it's supposed to be about environmentally sound practices and so on and so forth. So there's meaning in the term. Is that the same meaning that we would have if we were not to look at an Anishinaabe translation, Anishinaabemowin translation? Because why? Are there two or more systems going on here? Yeah. There's the kind of westernized education that's going on. In the time period, 1817, just prior to that, Shingwa Counts, a tribal leader from this area, Garden River First Nation, Shingwak, or Shingwa Counts as he's often referred to. He is the guy who climbed up the American flagpole when they planted the American flag at Fort Brady in Sault Ste. Marie. He climbed up the flagpole, took it down. He said, "This is Ojibwe land. Respect our sovereignty. Don't raise a flag here until you talk to us." That's pretty bold, right, to walk into someone's camp, climb their flagpole, and take their flag down? That takes some guts. Wow. You know, they got guns and stuff. Anyway, pretty tough guy. But he also had a vision. This is a leader of people, an Anishinaabe leader who had a vision for the future of Anishinaabe education. And in that vision, he espoused the idea that we need to be rooted in our American Indian traditions from this area, but we also need to make sure that we're looking at what is good in these other systems. He had a vision of a teaching wigwam, if you will, where people would come together from multiple cultures and they would share the best knowledge about medicine and politics and land and everything, you name it. I mean, he was thinking about, you know, what could it look like? So he saw the utility of both forms of education. But the key term was that it was under Indian control. We controlled how it happened. We didn't just give our kids up to somebody and say, hey, go educate them. We controlled how they were supposed to be educated. Sovereignty. Okay, so that's a key term that certainly would have been an ambiguous statement that we'd need to look for meaning for, that we would certainly say, well, what does that mean in today's society? You know, should we only control the schools that are on reservation, like Bawating? Or should we have some control in state-run public schools as well? Because the 92% of our citizens are out there in state-run public schools. Well, certainly it has implications for that. Yeah, the Indian meaning, the deconstruction of these treaty terms. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. They're not just some paper that someone wrote something down on in a bar and said, oh, you know, there's a napkin, there goes that treaty term. No, these are the supreme law of the land along with the United States Constitution. So maybe when we're ready to throw the U.S. Constitution out the window, well, maybe then they'll say, okay, we'll throw the treaties out with them. But until that day comes, these are supposed to be the supreme law of the land. So do we have treaty rights to impact, or should we have treaty rights? Should they be interpreted as a shared responsibility for the education of Anishinaabe citizens, regardless of whether they're in tribal schools or public schools in state? Certainly. Certainly. We should have that kind of shared responsibility because they're shared people. We obviously have that. So that model fits into that. Okay. Another term here, very important. Some. You said some. Well, some of who? the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi tribes. Okay, what if some means 0 or 100? Liberal, conservative. What's the most liberal definition of some? 100. Some can mean all in that most liberal sense, because some may be all. Maybe those who wish their children hereafter educated is everybody. And everybody in that instance would then be some. So you can see how these canons of deconstruction play into contemporary Indian education now. If we were to ever go to the Supreme Court of the United States and approach them with the idea of what kind of Indian education should be afforded to Anishinaabe tribes here in Michigan, you better believe if they were to follow stare decisis, follow their own rules in deconstructing treaty terms and in the protection of Aboriginal rights and the subsequent federal Indian education legislation and so on and so forth, we would have a huge system under Indian control. It would be an amazing thing. I don't know that the Supreme Court is quite structured to deal with that right now, though. I don't know that I would be very comfortable with the current Supreme Court. Anyway, that is another example of a seminar sampler that we would kind of engage through a discussion thread, this kind of analysis. Very exciting. At least I'm excited. Best practices in American Indian education. This seminar is a survey of best practices in Indian education. Seminar participants will be required to research and compare and contrast federal, tribal, and state and privately funded Indian education projects. Again, it's a mix of synchronous and asynchronous, intensive use discussion forum, but in this one, we really make a great use of live recorded chats with Indian education professionals. And this is really cool because we get these people on there who represent different areas of Indian education. We use two texts, Next Steps from Tippecanoe and Swisher, that have a lot of good, maybe a little bit dated, but the content's very good still, about a kind of a vast approach to Indian education. And we also use Look to the Mountain. You've seen I've been drawing on Kaihete throughout this presentation with his perspective on what would comprise a traditional Indian education system. And, of course, other materials that are presented by our presenters. That they say, hey, you should read this or have your students read this before my presentation. If you're going to National Indian Education Association conference this year, 3 of the seminar participants and myself actually developed a descriptive account of the seminar, the pilot seminar, and that's going to be available for distribution at NIEA. We're just fine-tuning it right now. But there's another great outcome. Here we have an opportunity to engage Indian education professionals in activity, scholarly activity, like writing articles, writing documents that they're going to need in their own professions. Some of these people are going to go on and be university professionals. Some are going to be K-12 professionals. Some, who knows, tribal education folks. But they're going to need to show how they're developing themselves professionally. Well, one of the things we can do that, I've certainly promoted is article writing. Let's create technical reports. Let's create documents. Let's write grants. Let's use this as an opportunity to really increase their professional development. All right. How are we doing on time? I get kind of lost in my passion here, so. About 10 minutes? Okay, so we need to move on. I'm just going to kind of breeze through this. We're not going to really do any engage, but I'm just going to kind of give you an idea. Best and worst Indian education experience exercise. Participants in this exercise are asked to think and write about their best and worst K-12 Indian education experience from their own education. That means when you were in K-12, what was your best interaction regarding Indian education? And also, what was your worst? And so they would think about this. They would type up their posting. They would post it on the discussion thread. And it's kind of personal, yeah, but certainly something that they would be willing to share. I'm not going to say you have to get into the nitty-gritty. It's what they're willing to present. And so they then post those things. And then the participants are asked to consider how their experience have influenced their perspective on what they now consider best practices in Indian education. Because before they did this activity, they actually posted a definition of best practice. And so their definition of best practice was kind of like, in their own words, would you consider a best practice in Indian education? Well, now I'm talking about their worst and best experiences, and then we're asking, well, how do you think your perspectives on best practices in education is affected by your experiences? Because it does shape how we look at best practice. You're never going to find best practice defined out there in the same format by anyone. We all have our difference of opinion individually on what we would consider a best practice. Now, you can look at the United States Department of Education. You can say, okay, according to the United States Department of Education, a best practice is scientifically based. It is blah, 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 blah. It has its parameters of what would be considered best practice. And every organization, again, you go from DOE to Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services has a different definition of best practice. And you go from agency to agency, organization to organization. Everybody has a different definition of best practice, but it all is informed by individuals and how they ultimately look at the definition and how they think about their own experience. And that's why we want to connect the dots. We want to say, you know what, we're not dealing with organizations necessarily. We're dealing with individuals in organizations. We're dealing with human relationships. And also to remember that best practices as defined by American Indian tribes is not necessarily just without scientific validity. In fact, someone recently at the 7th Generation Climate Conference in Boulder, Colorado, some of you may have heard of Dan Wildcat. He made a point about saying, Dan Wildcat co-authored Power in Place, Indian Education in America with Vine Deloria. He made a point of saying, you know what, all the time you have scientists saying, well, that's not scientifically proven, this Indian perspective on this. Imagine thousands and thousands of years of trial and error experiences culminating in the current oral tradition about interactions between humans and their land and invalidating that because they didn't use a control study. Is that an absurdity? Yes, it is. We can't necessarily discount traditional knowledge because it didn't happen in a laboratory setting. The idea of traditional knowledge, in fact, does not come from a laboratory setting. It comes from the real world. Yes? Definitely. Sure, sure. Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it really comes down to sometimes the rub between qualitative and quantitative research paradigms. Yeah. Right. So, yeah, best practice can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and it's very important how we define from the internal emic versus etic perspective on what we consider best practice in Indian education. Hmm. Right, but we don't accept it necessarily from tribes. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, emic and etic, inside versus outside perspectives. Oftentimes we rely, in fact, on anthropologists or archaeologists to define in a Western scientific perspective, well, what is the relationship between Indian and science? But we don't oftentimes give it an emic perspective, an insider's view. Yeah. Right. Right. Oh, yeah. Hmm. Yeah. It's so important, and it's such a travesty that we haven't, until now, actually started dealing with some of this. How many years have, Les Wong talked about neglect. Well, there's no bigger instance of neglect in the state of Michigan neglecting its responsibilities in Indian education. That's it. Yeah. Retiring, that's just being tired all over again, right? The last one, tribal state-specific issues in Indian Ed, structured to provide an opportunity for individuals to interact with others interested in exploring Indian education issues specific to their tribes or states. We actually, in this seminar, would send out invitations for people to participate in live recorded chats representing different levels of government or organizational perspectives, sometimes on both sides of the issue. You know, I actually talked to some folks here in Michigan about the idea, why don't we use a seminar to talk about the Michigan Indian tuition waiver? Why don't we get people on both sides who feel strongly about one way or the other and get them together so that they can look at the literature, the material that's available about the history of it and current status, and really talk it out in a very structured environment, a very safe environment, versus, you know, the kind of stuff that goes on with those kind of issues right now, where it's a lot of backstabbing and, you know, dark alley kind of stuff. But, you know, what a great way to resolve issues and to look towards solutions, you know. Give you an example. We use the required text, the manual for chief state school officers and state education agencies. Here's a concept paper that was developed by one of the students in there. A Blackfeet Sioux third-grade teacher at Vina Chatham in Browning, Montana, on the Blackfeet Reservation, utilized the seminar as an opportunity to develop a concept paper for utilizing technology to advance Blackfeet language revitalization. She actually put a concept paper that she intends to submit to the Gates Foundation for funding. That's so cool. You know, she wants to use technology, and, you know, if you're involved in revitalization of native languages at all, you'll know that there's some discrepancy even in the traditional community about using technology. Not every elder is in favor of using technology. Some people say, nah, I don't know. You got to watch what you record, and, you know, don't take a picture of that, don't record this. You know, who's programming it, by the way? And, you know, I mean, there's a lot of questions for good reason. People have really done a disservice to our language and cultural values. But she's looking at this as an opportunity to deal with that idea. Great stuff. I'm very excited for her, and I hope. The future. TEDNA is currently waiting to hear about refunding of the Interwest Equity Assistance Center where I work. I'm kind of been waiting myself because it's my job. And as you know, we all need our bread and butter. And we're still kind of waiting to hear. But in the event that TEDNA that the IEAC where I work does not receive refunding, TEDNA will very likely be looking to other institutions to carry on this process. I've really encouraged them to look at institutions, tribal institutions. You know, maybe it's time to move it to a tribal community college or a university like Haskell. You know, maybe we need to, in Indian country, take this over as a function of our educational institutions. But then again, I don't know. You know, we haven't had anyone knocking at the door saying, hey, I'll do it if, you know, Colorado State University isn't going to have it. Another thing that may happen, I just interviewed at Harvard University as their executive director of their Native American programs last week, and I'm kind of waiting to hear back if I'm going to get that job. I'll know if I'm a finalist this week, and then I'll go interview again. Kind of not looking forward to leaving Michigan again, but what a great opportunity to do something on maybe a global scale through Harvard with indigenous in education issues. And if that happens, I'm certainly going to encourage Harvard to adopt the seminars. But I'd rather see it in Indian country, really, to be honest. I'd rather see our own colleges and universities adopt these things and work with TEDNA in communities like this to really make it happen. So, miigwech, for more information about the seminars, certainly email me. I'll be more than glad to tell you tons and tons and tons of stuff about them. It happens to be a passion of mine. For more information about TEDNA, please visit their website and probably look for the announcements of the upcoming seminars once we receive idea about refunding on the TEDNA website as well. Miigwech, I'll gladly entertain questions and ideas throughout the day. I'll be around, and I appreciate you joining me this morning. So.